Hey guys, thanks for joining this tutorial. Today we're going to talk about inheritance in Solidity. Before playing around with some code in Remix, let's take a quick look at some of the key features of inheritance in Solidity. Solidity supports multiple inheritance and polymorphism, and we use the is keyword to derive from one or more contracts. So for example, if we have three contracts A, B and C, and we would like to create a new contract D, that inherits from all those three contracts, we would write contract T is A, B, C. The order in which those contracts are listed is important. In this case, A would be the most base contract and C would be the most derived contract. Now let's assume all our contracts A, B and C implement a function called test. If in our new contract D we would call this function test, we would call the function on the most derived contract, which in our case is C. Now if you would like to call the function on a lesser derived contract, for example the function test defined in our contract A, we need to write a.test. We can also use the super keyword to call the function one level higher up in the inheritance hierarchy. So for example, if in our contract D we would call super.test, we would call the test function that's defined in our most derived contract, which is contract C. Also, a derived contract can access all non-private members. So all state variables and all functions that are either public, external or internal can be accessed in a derived contract. In order to allow function overriding, we need to use the virtual keyword. So for example, let's say in our contract A, we have a function called test, and we would like to override with a different implementation the same function in our contract D. Then we would use the keyword virtual on the test function defined in contract A, and in contract D, we would use the override keyword. To clarify what we just learned, let's take a look at some code. We have a very basic contract here with a license identifier, the Solidity version, and a contract called C1 with three simple functions. All functions are public pure and they all return an unsigned integer. Function 1 returns the value 1, 1. The first one stands for contract 1, second one for function 1, second function returns 1, 2, 2 for function 2, and so on. So let's say we would like to create a new contract that inherits from our contract C1. In that case, we would write contract, for example C2, we use the is keyword, C1. Now our contract C2 would implement all public members defined in our contract C1. So in that case, if you compile and we deploy the contract C2, we would have all the functions available. We would have function F1, F2 and F3. Now let's say in our contract C2 we would like to override function 1 and return a different value. So let's take function 1, let's just add it to our contract, and as we just learned, in order to allow function overriding, we need to make in our base contract, we need to make the function virtual, so we just add the virtual keyword. So now we are allowed to override this function. In the contract in which we are overriding the function, we just add the override keyword. We also can add the virtual keyword here. So for example, if we would define another contract like C3, which inherits from C2, this would allow us once again to override this function. We won't need this here, so let's take it off. Okay, let's deploy our contract. Make sure you select Remix VM. And we are only interested in our contract C2 that inherits from C1. Let's deploy it. And let's take a look. We'll have all members that are non-private. So in this case, we have F1, F2, and F3. Let's take a look. Okay, all of them are here. So if we call, for example, function F2, well, no surprise, we should get this result, 1, 2. Let's give it a try. We get back 1, 2. What happens if we call f1? Let's just change this. We make this 2 for contract 2 and 1. Let's redeploy it. We delete this contract. Redeploy only contract 2. We just tested f2, but what we are interested now is f1. We have f1 defined here and here. That's the overridden one. So we assume we should get back the value 2, 1. Okay, let's call it. That's fine. Of course, we get the result of the overridden function. Let's add another contract. We call it contract C3. So we just make it another base contract. So C3 won't inherit from any other contract. But let's say we implement a function with the same name as in our contract C1. So we also get a function f2, which again is public pure and returns an unsigned integer. So here we return 3 for contract 3 and 1. So we can easily distinguish it when we test it later on. So now let's make things a bit more interesting. Let's say we define a new contract. We call it C4. And we would like to inherit C4 from C2. So we make it is C2. And also from C3. So we can test multiple inheritance. What are we doing here? Okay, we inherit from C2, and C2 also inherits from C1. So in this contract, we will have all the functions defined in C1 and all the functions defined in C2. So in this case, C2 would be the most derived contract, and C1 would be the most base contract. But as we add an additional contract, C3, so C3 becomes the most derived. The most base contract will be C1, and C2 is just in between. So the order in which we specify contracts is important. Now we have another problem. As you can see, in contract C1, we have a function called f2, but we have exactly the same function signature in contract C3. The problem is now, because C1 and C3 are both of them are base level contracts. So we're getting an error here. And in order to resolve this error, we need to override our function f2, which is specified in both base contracts. So we just take our function f2, we override it, but in order to override it in our contract C3, we also have to add the virtual keyword. Virtual, and the same stuff on our base contract. Function f2 is declared as virtual in both contracts. Now here we need to specify the override keyword. But as we have two contracts that implement the same function f2, we also need to specify the contracts. So here the most base contract is C1, so we specify C1. It's actually not C2, it's C1, because C2 inherits from C1. And we also specify our contract, the most derived contract, C3. Now we should be fine. So for example, we could return here 4, 1. But of course, you could also do something like, for example, if you say, well, okay, I don't want to return a new value. I want to return, for example, exactly the same result as I have, for example, either in contract C1 or in any other contract. So in that way, you could directly specify the contract. You could also say something like return, for example, C1.f2. Or you could specify C3F2. So that's also a possibility. So what do we have here? We have a contract that derives from C2, which also derives from C1. So we get F1, F2, F3, and F1 is overridden. And we also have all the functions defined, all the non private functions defined in our context C3. So in this case, we only have this function, which can be called. Now I would like to call function f1, but function f1 is defined here in contract C1, and it's also defined here. So what happens if I call function f1? For example, let's call this just call f1. We don't need the override. So, okay, we can leave the rest. And now we say something like return simply f1. So what will happen? Will we get 1, 1 for contract 1, or will we get 2, 1? Well, in this case, we're gonna test it in a minute. We will get the result from the most derived contract. The most derived contract, in this case, well, C3 would be the most derived contract, but in C3 we don't have function 1. So the second most derived contract is, of course, C2. The most base contract would be C1. So in this case, I say we should get the result from C2 F1, which is 2, 1. Let's also test the super keyword. What happens if we, for example, call super F1, something like this, and here we just add super, because F1 may be defined in different contracts, and as we learned at the beginning, the super keyword calls the function in the most derived contract, so basically in the contract one level up in the inheritance hierarchy. Well, one level up in the inheritance hierarchy would be the function on C2. We don't have anything on C3, but we have something on C2. So in this case, we would get the exact same result, 2, 1. Okay, now the question is, what can we do in order to call the function f1 on our contract C1, or on any other contract where it would be defined on? Well, let's give it a try. In our example, we only have it defined on C1 and on C2. So let's call this function call C1 function 1. Now in this case, we can call the function if we simply specify the name of the contract, which is C1. And in this case, I would like to have 1, 1 as a result. Once again, we select our contract C4. That's the only one we're interested. We deploy it. Now let's take a look. Okay, we have, of course, our functions f1, f2, f3, but we also have the functions we added, call C1 F1, call F1, and call super F1. Okay, first try. What do we get when we call F2? Well, we should get 4, 1, because that's how we have overridden the function. No surprise here. Next example was call F1. Well, call F1, we said we should get back 2, 1, the result from contract 2. Let's call F1. That's exactly what we get. The next example was call super F1. The super keyword calls the function which is next up in the inheritance hierarchy. So let's give it a try. Call super F1 should give the same result. That's fine. And finally, we call F1 on our contract C1, which of course should give us 1, 1. Let's give it a try. Call C1 F1, which should give us 1, 1. Perfect. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I see you in the next video. Bye bye.